Hey everyone, you're watching We Had That, and today I'm going to talk about the 1986 Wave 5 G.I. Joe Sci-Fi action figure. When G.I. Joe came out in 1982, I thought they were the coolest toys in the store. My friends and I collected them frantically. For the most part, we were each looking for our own favorite characters, but the one figure that we all wanted was Flash, the laser rifle trooper. Not only did we all think that he was immensely cool, but we were all somehow under the impression that he was G.I. Joe. We were little kids, so we had little kid misunderstandings about things. But to this day, I have no idea what made all of us think that there was a single guy named G.I. Joe and that it was Flash. But there you have it. I still remember telling my father that I really needed this figure because he was G.I. Joe. And my father, who had been a soldier himself, patiently explained to me that G.I. Joe was just a term used for all United States soldiers, so actually, there was no one single G.I. Joe. The entire team was made up of G.I. Joes. But Flash was still cool, so I still needed him. In 1982, my friends and I were still young, and we were all coming from several years of playing with Star Wars figures. Everything in our small world had been space-themed up to this point. Military themes were just starting to come into our lives, so the idea of a laser guy on the G.I. Joe team made perfect sense. Plus, the only thing that really made Flash stand out from the other guys was that he wore red pads on his chest, arms, and legs, over the same green outfit that most of the other guys wore. In 1986, we were a lot older, wiser, more sophisticated. We knew there were no laser troopers in the Army. There weren't laser guys in the Army, were there? But certainly, there were no neon green-suited laser troopers in the Army. That was just crazy. Maybe a diver in a mint green dive suit with an orange helmet? Yeah, that seems legit. Or a medic wearing a vibrantly red jumpsuit with white accents? But certainly not a guy in neon green. My friends and I had already seen that G.I. Joe was headed away from strictly military-looking figures. We rolled our eyes at Blowtorch a couple of years earlier because from what we'd seen in books and movies, the flamethrower guy should have just been wearing a regular olive drab uniform. But Sci-Fi was another step too far. He showed up in the store wearing a neon green and silver helmet with black visor, a green jumpsuit with a silver chest piece with green stripes, some kind of weird black wristbands, and black gloves. A black belt with a silver buckle, green pants with black pads on the inside of the legs, and pockets with black boxes on the front, and silver boots. If neon green wasn't bad enough in terms of camouflage, the silver was even worse. We knew soldiers were supposed to do their best to make sure they had nothing reflective because a reflection of the sun could give away their location to the enemy, and this guy was covered in silver. Sci-Fi came with 3 pieces of gear. First, he had a huge black laser rifle. It was honestly pretty cool, even though probably unrealistic. At least it was black, the color that just about all of the G.I. Joe weapons should have been. Next, he had a black rubber tube that connected the laser rifle to the 3rd piece of gear, a neon green backpack that matched his outfit, and I assume was the power pack for his laser rifle. I would have preferred black, but at that point, it didn't really matter. One thing I really did like about the backpack was that the rifle could attach to it. I was always kind of a sucker for gear that fit together. In the end, yeah, I still bought Sci-Fi, because secretly, he was kind of cool, even in a ridiculous, unrealistic for a soldier kind of way. According to his file card, Seymour P. Fine is the real file name for Sci-Fi. All it really says is that he's a very easygoing guy from Montana who has great aim and can sit very still. It actually surprised me when I went back and looked to see how much Sci-Fi was in the G.I. Joe cartoon. He first appeared in the opening credits of the 1986 season, riding the Triple T with Sergeant Slaughter, and again at the end of the intro lineup in front of the American flag. In Arise Serpentor Arise Part 1, Sci-Fi can be seen for a second on the firing range and again a few minutes later after Cobra attacks the Joe base. His head is in a crowd of Joes for a split second in a shot on the Joe airfield. Last, we see Sci-Fi marching up a mountain with other Joes as Sergeant Slaughter yells at them. In part 2 of Arise, Serpentor Arise, if you look closely, you can see Sci-Fi running out of the G.I. Joe headquarters with some of his teammates about 3 minutes into the episode. He's on the back of a tank for a second when the Joes are on their way to guard Napoleon's tomb in Paris, and then is shown briefly from the front, where he even has a line of dialogue, and 2 more lines of dialogue in the next scene where he's on lookout on the roof of a building. Then again later, from the same position, another line of dialogue when Cobra shows up. Sci-Fi even gets a chance to fire off some shots from his rooftop position. As a side note, Sci-Fi's specialty is Laser Trooper, yet he has the same laser rifle in the cartoon that everyone else has, which kind of makes his specialty seem not so special. In the middle of the episode, we see Sci-Fi one last time when Hawk puts him in charge just before leaving the scene. In part 3 of Arise, Serpentor Arise, Sci-Fi's only appearance is offering Sergeant Slaughter a cup of coffee, but at least he gets a line of dialogue. Sci-Fi isn't in part 4, and in Arise, Serpentor Arise part 5, he's only seen for a second during the Battle of Washington, D.C. as Serpentor is trying to take over the Capitol, and another second in the very last frame of the show, saluting the flag with the other Joes. In Computer Complications, Sci-Fi, without his helmet, plays cards with Leatherneck at a restaurant and has one line of dialogue. Even though any of the G.I. Joe characters could have been used in this next role and it has nothing to do with his specialty, Sci-Fi gets a lot of screen time and dialogue in the episode Cobrathon. Right from the beginning, he's part of the team infiltrating the Cobra base searching for computer hackers. When Lifeline falls into a tank filled with piranhas, Sci-Fi tries to shoot the fish before lowering his gun down for Lifeline to grab and come out. This gives Lifeline an opportunity to talk about how much of a pacifist he is and how he won't touch the rifle, so Sci-Fi reaches his arm down to pull him out. Honestly, I don't know if I'd be all that excited about grabbing onto the firing end of a laser rifle to get pulled out of the water when the guy holding the gun could simply reach in and give me a hand. Right after this, Lifeline and Sci-Fi get captured by Cobra. So what nefarious plan has Cobra hatched in this episode? They're running a telethon to raise $5 billion, and the captured Joes will provide the entertainment. After the 2 Joes spin on a giant roulette wheel, Zorana tells the audience that Sci-Fi will meet his end by being buried alive in the winnings from a giant slot machine. Fortunately, the Joe team shows up just in the nick of time to shoot the giant jar and release the winnings. The episode $1 Million Medic focuses on Lifeline, but Sci-Fi does appear driving a Havoc for a second before it gets blown up, and then talking to a civilian who's on the G.I. Joe base during a Cobra attack. Sci-Fi has a quick appearance in the episode Iceberg Goes South as part of the team rescuing Iceberg, who has been turned into a killer whale by Cobra. Wait, what? Sci-Fi's most screen time is in an episode Gray Hairs and Growing Pains, but it's mostly as a background character. Sci-Fi first shows up flying in on a Falcon glider, which is a little bit strange since it was a 1983 vehicle that had been discontinued by the time the episode came out in October of 1986. Falcon and Sci-Fi team up to question an actress about a commercial she did for free for Cobra, but they end up stopping a bunch of rampaging elephants from the set of her movie. From this point on, Sci-Fi and a few of the other Joes are out of their uniforms to sneak into a gym owned by Cobra. Overall, despite his screen time, Sci-Fi doesn't really do much throughout the entire episode. Although Gray Hairs and Growing Pains give Sci-Fi a little bit more total screen time, the episode that feels like he's utilized the most is definitely My Brother's Keeper, which portrays Sci-Fi as a big science fiction fan. This is probably the only time in the cartoon that he's given any kind of character traits. Up until this point, I'd always thought that the name Sci-Fi was just given to him because of his interest in lasers. But in this episode, the first time that we see Sci-Fi, he's watching the Transformers cartoon on TV. Sergeant Slaughter takes Sci-Fi to the World Science Fiction Convention because Cobra is planning to recruit the giant jerk scientist Jeremy Pincer, who will be there. Slaughter thinks that Sci-Fi will fit right into the convention. The Joe duo arrive just in time to see Dr. Mindbender recruiting Pincer, and a laser shootout ensues. The science fiction fans in attendance think the whole thing is a planned show. When Pincer takes Cobra up on their offer, Sci-Fi and Sergeant Slaughter plant a tracking device so that they, along with Pincer's little brother, can find out where Cobra is taking him and follow him back to Dr. Mindbender's lab. Pincer doesn't want to be rescued, so they retreat with Zorana following. Sci-Fi provides cover for their escape, but when ordered to fire on his own brother, Pincer won't comply and his relationship with Cobra sours quickly. Fortunately, Sci-Fi is there to help rescue him from Cobra. In The Most Dangerous Thing in the World, Sci-Fi is just an extra in a few spots. He can be seen for a second retreating to the G.I. Joe headquarters, and for another second, firing out of a gun port. Then he appears for less than a second, shooting at Cobras that are entering the G.I. Joe headquarters, and a few times following a charge led by General Hawk. Sci-Fi's biggest moment in this episode is when he and Lowlight shoot a hole in the floor, but aside from that, he's mostly just filler. Although Sci-Fi isn't much of a main character in Ninja Holiday, this episode does have some of the coolest images of Sci-Fi. We first see him coming out of the water in a swamp, and then we get a pretty cool shot of him firing his rifle. He's at the G.I. Joe headquarters for a briefing for a second, and then behind Beachhead during a raid at a bar for a second. And finally, part of the team in the jungle. But despite all of these locations, and a few lines of dialogue, none of the shots of Sci-Fi are very long, and he isn't specifically important to the episode. In the episode Nightmare Assault, Sci-Fi is only on screen for a few seconds, but he pilots a Conquest jet attacking a Cobra base and later pilots a Tomahawk. Sci-Fi and Lady J can be seen evacuating citizens with a Tomahawk. In Second-Hand Emotions, Sci-Fi is seen testing new armor at the weapons depot right before chasing after the Dreadnoks, who have shot the Joes with Dr. Mindbender's mood-altering receivers. While on the chase, the Joes become incapacitated by Mindbender's signals. Sci-Fi shows up a few times throughout the episode, like when he pulls Iceberg out from under a Jeep, or when he's with a bunch of Joes in the back of a truck. But nothing about his role here is specific to him as a character. He could have been replaced by any of the Joes in any of these scenes. In Sins of Our Fathers, Sci-Fi is manning one of the guns on a killer whale, but that's really just a background character part. You barely see him at all. Sci-Fi shows up a few times in the crowd in the episode Into Your Tent, I Will Silently Creep. The Joe team members are missing gear, and Sci-Fi is one of the Joes asking about something that he's missing. He also talks to Lowlight about the food in the mess hall and can be seen along with a group of Joes in a briefing. Last, he's front and center in a group of Joes on a rescue team. His last appearances in the Sunbow series are in the G.I. Joe movie. We see Sci-Fi for a few seconds driving an Striker, and later a tiny image of Sci-Fi along with a huge group of other Joes. After the Sunbow G.I. Joe cartoon, Sci-Fi was in 3 episodes of the new G.I. Joe cartoon with a completely new look. Ironically, while all of the other Joes seemed to look pretty silly to me by that point, Sci-Fi's new gray outfit actually looked a little bit more realistic. Although Sci-Fi did appear in Marvel's G.I. Joe comic books, the comic books were somewhat more realistic and geared towards an older audience than the cartoons, so there wasn't as much room for a character like Sci-Fi. His first appearance was in issue number 64, where he was a background character at a G.I. Joe party. He was basically just a shadowy figure who could only be identified by the shape of his helmet and black goggles. Sci-Fi could have been anyone in this issue. It was just a random person to fill up the room and could have been replaced with any other Joe character. Sci-Fi appeared again in issue 65, where he was the laser operator on the Defiant. His total role in this issue was confined to 3 pages, but at least he was much more easily recognizable and he was mentioned by name. Plus, this was one of the few times that Sci-Fi was actually used in the comic book for his specialty, operating a laser. Sci-Fi appears next in issue number 72, but we only see the back of his head and only in one panel. There's nothing about this appearance that actually needed a laser rifle expert, and it could have been anyone on the Joe team. In issue number 74, Sci-Fi is given an order to take out one of the maggots, but that's really his only role in this issue. He's at least mentioned by name twice. Issue number 75 includes a huge number of different Joes, and Sci-Fi is one of them. He doesn't have any dialogue, no one mentions him or talks to him. He can just be seen as one of the Joes in a mass of Joes throughout this issue. In issue number 77, Sci-Fi stands around in a group of Joes and Cobras all watching a cat fight between Zorana and Lady J. There is a really good image of him in one panel, but realistically, this is another one where anyone, Joe or Cobra, could have taken his place here. He didn't even have a single word of dialogue. Sci-Fi doesn't appear again in the comics for a couple of years. His next appearance is in the giant-sized issue 100 in 1990. He appears in 3 panels, all on one page, where he is needed to use a laser rifle to melt a lock on a door within G.I. Joe's headquarters, the Pit. So this appearance actually does require Sci-Fi specifically, and not just any random Joe. The next time Sci-Fi shows up in the comics was years later in 1994 as a character in issues number 145 through 149 as part of the Star Brigade. And by that time, it had been years since we'd seen the original Sci-Fi figure in stores, comics, or cartoons. At that point, I wasn't even reading G.I. Joe comics anymore. Sci-Fi appeared in issue number 2 of Order of Battle, which was basically a single page for each figure that had been released at that point, with text from their file card and a new image. Sci-Fi was on the box art for the Tomahawk in 1986, but he really didn't appear on much other G.I. Joe artwork. I'm curious to hear what your thoughts are on Sci-Fi. Did you have a Sci-Fi action figure when you were a kid? What did you think of him when you were a kid? What do you think of him now? Was he an important member of your team, or did he just sit back at the base peeling potatoes? Let me know in the comments below. Also, please give this video a thumbs up, and if you have a chance, it would be great if you would share it on social media. If you enjoy my content, please subscribe to my channel and hit that notifications bell so you'll know when I post new videos. And one last thing, if you're a fan of toys, you should know about ToyLanta, the biggest toy show in the southeastern United States, held annually just north of Atlanta, Georgia. Visit ToyLanta.com for more information. As always, thanks for watching.